Build 42, the long-awaited major update to Project Zomboid that was set to change the game we love in a multitude of ways. But are all of those changes actually for the better? I decided to take a community survey that collected real feedback from real players and ultimately find out if the Project Zomboid fanbase actually enjoys Build 42. So join me as we take a deep dive into those findings. Oh, and before we get too far into this one, the survey itself is linked down in the description if you still want to have your say. Now, in order to set the stage for the survey and make sure we knew what kind of players were providing feedback, we started out with a couple of questions to help provide context on the participant. Mainly, we made sure to ask if the individual had actually played Build 42. If they hadn't, the survey would stop there and they would also be prompted to leave the reason they haven't tried the new version just yet. As you would probably expect, the most common reasons were either that players were waiting for multiplayer to be available for Build 42, or they were waiting for it to reach the stable branch so they didn't have to experience bugs and potentially lose progress when updates were pushed. We had a grand total of 593 responses that made it past this qualifying question at the time of making this video, which gave us a really solid group to pull data from. The last of our preliminary questions was how many hours approximately each person had dedicated to playing Project Zomboid. We had a really broad range of answers for this one, and that's a really good thing because some of the feedback would come from hardened veterans with thousands of hours of playtime, and others would come from entirely new players with under 50 hours in some cases. So with the groundwork for the survey done, we could now start asking players about specific elements of Build 42. These questions would ask our guinea pigs how they felt on a scale of 1 to 10, with 0 representing don't like it at all, and 10 being really like it. This of course meant 5 would be neutral, and I will say that this one was a slip up on my part I made in the survey, and definitely a learning opportunity for next time. I should have included a separate answer to allow participants to basically say they hadn't tried this feature enough yet to form an opinion, but you'll soon see in the comments people left that most just answered 5 for neutral if they hadn't tried a feature enough to feel they could give a good answer. We took all of the answers in the survey and put them into one big spreadsheet, allowing us to pull percentages, average scores, and track correlations between certain factors in some cases. All to say, it got very sweaty very quickly, but if there's anything putting out more body odor than me going through all this data, it's all of you gaming chair Andys watching this video. That's why today's sponsor is We Are Wild, the natural deodorant that does things differently. If you're like me, then once in a while you'll be settling in for a gaming session that's likely to go on for a few more hours than intended. Wild's invisible and fast-drying formula will keep your underarms protected for a full 24 hours, with no white flakes or stains. So if that loot run to Louisville takes an unexpected detour, you won't need to worry about carrying a similar scent to the zombies you're fighting in-game. Instead, you'll smell of coconut and vanilla, honey and almond, or perhaps fresh cotton and sea salt. Wild uses only the best natural ingredients, which are cruelty-free, vegan-friendly, and contain no aluminium salt or parabens, keeping your pores open. Not to mention, Wild is fervently against single-use plastics, so you'll only ever need to buy one stick, and when it runs dry, simply purchase a refill pack, each one saving 30 grams of plastic. So, if you're ready for a roll-on deodorant that actually works, use the link down in the description and my code AtomicDuck for 20% off your entire order with Wild. Thank you again to Wild for the sponsor. Let's get back to today's video. Now, one of the biggest parts of Build 42 was the various changes made to the crafting system. It's a substantial overhaul compared to how things used to work, and I was intrigued to see how people felt about its various components, starting with the implementation of workbenches. As you can see from our handy bar chart here, the majority of players answered between 6 and 9, with just shy of 72% of responses within this range. A large number of answers within this range, however, were in the lower end, which seems to reflect a general feeling that while the workbenches are widely liked, there's certainly room for improvement, which incidentally is pretty much how I feel about them too, but we'll talk about my opinions a little bit later. First, let's take a look at the other crafting related questions in the survey, what kind of scores they got, and then we'll see some of the comments from you guys before I share my own thoughts. Now, next in this section is possibly the most divisive question in this entire survey. We had answers all over the spectrum for this one, and that question was, how do you feel about the crafting menu UI in Build 42? You can probably already understand why this one wasn't exactly the most popular feature covered in the survey. As you can see from the graph, this was far from positive, with only 2.5% giving it a 10 out of 10. The most weighted section was between 0 and 4, with over 50% of answers falling between these numbers. What's particularly intriguing though is that another 32.5% answered between 6 and 10. So while a lot of people feel this is an area that could do with some improvement, myself included, there is actually a fairly large portion of players that find it reasonably usable and in need of small touch-ups, or think it's just fine as is. As you can probably imagine, based on these scores, there was a lot of feedback on this one, and it wasn't as clear-cut as I had expected it to be. Last in this crafting section though, I asked how players felt about the new liquid transfer system, and this one was mostly positive, with 65% of people answering in the range of 6 to 10, and only 22.5% of answers in the range of 0 to 4. So in general, a much more positive outlook on this feature. Finally, having asked 3 questions already on separate elements of crafting, I wanted to make sure we collected overall feelings on this section. As you can see from the bar chart shown on screen, most scored crafting overall with a 7 or 8, and over 72% placing their answers in the range of 6 to 10. The average scores out of 10 across all the answers from our participants were 6.6 for workbenches, a measly 4.3 for the crafting menu, 6.3 for the liquid transfer system, and an overall score of 6.5 for crafting mechanics in Build 42. Now, this is where we get to the good stuff, and that's the written feedback for this section. This was some of the most detailed feedback we got in the responses for the entire survey. Lots of people felt very strongly about features mentioned in the crafting segment, with many of the complaints spanning from a dislike of the crafting UI itself. Just a few of these comments are being displayed on screen now, but believe me when I say there were many, many more along similar lines. Now, those of you that have watched some of my more recent videos will already know that I largely agree with the sentiment behind this sort of feedback. The crafting UI not being user-friendly, being overwhelming, requests for the development team to hire modders with experience in the field, and even players saying they've been pushed away from crafting entirely because they couldn't figure out the interface. In my mind, the UI is functional, yes, but it is most certainly not user-friendly or easy to use, and ultimately, that's the main goal of large-scale crafting menus like these. With talented modders like Rocco being able to design more popular alternatives within the community, it does raise questions about whether the developers should take a page from their book or even just outright hire them, like they have with other members of the modding scene. Regardless of how things are resolved, it's clear the majority of players don't really enjoy things as they are in this area. Now, just to be thorough, I wanted to see if there was any chance that veteran players like myself were stuck in our ways and simply hate change. Maybe the newer players were finding the crafting menu easier to use. So we tested the average scores for the crafting UI section of the survey against players with under 100 hours. They scored it 4.47 on average. Players with over 100 hours scored it 4.35 on average. So we can effectively eliminate the argument that older players may just be finding it harder to adapt, because ultimately playtime doesn't seem to factor into the equation. There's several comments in our survey that voice their distaste towards the developers' decisions to remove some actions from the right-click menu as well, like the ones shown on screen now. The general feeling we got from the survey here is that some simple actions should remain on the right-click menu, especially those that are related to actual items in the world that the player can see, such as barricading windows or items in the player's inventory that aren't necessarily a craft, but instead an action. Overall, there was a definite split between the player base on whether workbenches and advanced crafting trees are really something that they want. Some comments, as you're seeing now, weren't too keen on the idea of this level of crafting depth coming to the game, while others were very supportive of the idea and simply believe that it hasn't quite reached its full potential or needs some adjustment to be properly implemented. On my side of things, I'm with the second camp here. I do support the idea behind the in-depth crafting trees, bringing longevity to the game in the form of long-term goals that will take a while to reach. But right now, the way crafting has been implemented makes it confusing to tackle, to the point where I'm simply pushed away from it altogether. Like many players have voiced in their feedback, I'm also not really sure why the developers are seemingly trying to move contextual actions away from the right-click menu and onto a crafting menu, adding yet more recipes to an already confusing interface. To me, it would make more sense to put any further changes to right-click actions on hold until the crafting UI has a new look, one that the majority of the community can get behind. Taking away right-click actions at this present moment simply serves to further stoke the fire and upset players that are already having trouble with the new crafting menus. Okay, so that was probably the most divisive part of the entire survey, but there are some more areas to cover, and while this section was far from clear-cut, there are some parts of Build 42 that were a resounding success according to our survey. We're looking at the game world itself next, specifically some of the changes to existing areas of the world and the addition of new areas. Our first question in this section asked players how they felt about the new areas added in Build 42, including basements and skyscrapers, and it's safe to say that you guys saw this as an absolute win, because over 70% of you scored this with full marks, a 10 out of 10. Less than 4% of players scored it lower than an 8, with an overall average score of a whopping 9.5 from the 593 responses we had. It was a very similar story with the next question, asking participants how they felt about existing areas of the map that were improved in Build 42. Again, a huge portion of players scored this a 10 out of 10, 63.9% to be exact, and much of the remaining responses being in that top set of numbers. The average score here was 9.3. As you can probably guess, most of the comments we received were incredibly positive to match the scores we were given in the survey, with a few of them mentioning minor bugs or rendering issues that display parts of the world incorrectly. Not much to discuss on this particular part of the survey, but just so you have my thoughts, I'm with the vast majority of players here. The new towns are incredible, and I would even go as far to say a big step up from the classic towns like Muldraw and Rosewood. It's a really good job those older sections got some love as well, where I think there'd be a real mismatch of quality across Kentucky. Basements are awesome and offer some unexpected looting opportunities that give you that dopamine rush once in a while when you find someone's secret hideaway or the perfect safe house opportunity, and skyscrapers offer a very real and daunting challenge for those looking to test themselves. The map designers knocked it out of the park with their work for Build 42, and the community clearly thinks the same. Sticking with changes to the environment around the player, the next question on our survey was about the new lighting in Build 42. For those unaware, this was changed in Build 41 from a much more rigid approach to a softer, slower diffusion from light sources. Darker areas are much darker, with light emanating from windows rather than just lighting up the whole room at the same intensity. Again, a largely successful implementation according to the players, with 52.8% giving this area of the update a solid 10 out of 10 score. As you can see from our bar chart representing this question, the vast majority of responses were in the ranges of 7 or higher. Our next question, based on the new view cone adjustments in Build 42, wasn't rated quite so highly, but still mostly positive. We still see the largest number of responses here being 10 out of 10, but there's also a few responses scoring either a 5 or a 6. There were a few bits of feedback from these two questions that did indicate some players didn't notice the change in the view cone between Build 41 and Build 42, which likely explains some of the 5s in there representing a neutral opinion. Some great responses with a lot of detail from these two questions, and as you would expect, most of them are positive. I really like that last comment especially, which hones in on a part of the lighting update I really enjoy. Darkness is now a real obstacle. In Build 41, it was definitely possible to find your way around in dark conditions, but it's absolutely hopeless in Build 42 unless you have a light source, and that adds to the uneasy feeling of fumbling through an unknown environment and creates a real challenge for the player. Firmly agree with you guys on this one, a net upgrade for the game. The average score from you folks at home was an 8.9 for lighting and 7.8 for the view cone. Okay, so that's the crafting segment of the survey covered, as well as the section where we take a look at the in-game world surrounding our character. But there is a very prominent area of the game that changed in some huge ways with Build 42 that I haven't covered just yet, and that is combat mechanics. Now, obviously the most controversial change to this area of the game was the addition of the muscle strain mechanic, especially after Build 42 initially released on the unstable branch before it was later dialed back. There were some very strong opinions. I wanted to see if the general sentiment towards muscle strain was now more positive, or whether there were still a lot of very negative opinions towards the feature. So we asked how our participants felt about it. In short, this was a very mixed bag. As you can see from our bar chart here, there are a lot of zeros, equally a lot of 10s, and a whole range of responses in between. The average score was 5.5, which is far from a successful score if we're looking at this from a development point of view, but I also think it's fair to ask the question, how much of this is a result of that first impression where muscle strain was much stronger than it is now? So we move on to the written feedback for this question, and again, it's as divided as the scores. On the one hand, we have comments like these that are largely supportive of the slower pace that muscle strain brings, making you think more about your actions and reinforcing you taking breaks between fights to rest and recover. And on the other hand, we have these kind of comments that are the absolute opposite. Players that don't like the feature as its default values or think it's too punishing for the average player. The crucial thing to remember here, of course, is that muscle strain can be dialed back in the sandbox settings, and many players that filled out our survey did share that they themselves have turned this down a fair bit. Now, interesting little anecdote for you here. While there were many comments about players turning muscle strain down, I didn't see any mentioning they've turned muscle strain up. Based on this alone, we could perhaps say it does need reducing a tad more, simply because new players are likely to just jump in without tweaking any sandbox settings, and this could turn them away from the game if they had a bad experience. But I don't think it's very far from where it needs to be. A little adjustment and they'll be all set. A lot of the feedback you folks left on our survey indicated similar opinions, saying that muscle strain is a good idea or that it feels well placed in Project Zomboid, but needs a bit more work to reach that sweet spot. I especially liked this comment that suggested muscle strain perhaps could be built up on a more gradual basis over an extended period of time rather than inside one or two fights. I'd be interested to hear what you guys might think about that down in the comment section of the video. So, muscle strain was, I would say, the biggest change to combat in Build 42, but we did also have some fundamental reworks of the aiming system for Firearms too, and I think the results from our survey on this may surprise some of you. When asked about the new aiming system, the most popular response, with 18.4%, was a 5 out of 10. Now, it's important to remember this symbolizes a neutral point of view, and it was evident from the written feedback we received that a hefty number of these 5s came from the fact many players simply didn't use Firearms at all in Build 42. That does raise the question of why not, and whether that is a problem in itself for the developers to look into, or if it's just one of those areas of the game that some players naturally move away from. Outside of that, the sentiment was essentially that the new aiming system was good or better than Build 41, but could certainly use some improvements. Many players took issue with the fact that shotguns were now far less usable at lower aiming skill, or with the current mechanics surrounding Firearms accuracy and XP gains. I will say that firearms in Project Zomboid are something that I used to really enjoy in Build 41, and while I personally love the new aiming system because it adds an actual skill component with having to place your crosshair over the target, I found it very difficult to engage properly with the setup in Build 42, just because there's no gateway firearms anymore that offer decent results at lower levels while you're grinding out XP and training your character. Formerly, shotguns used to fill this niche, and granted, they were a bit overpowered in Build 41, but now I think we may have gone too far the other direction, and this is why many players are just opting to stick with melee weapons entirely. Firearms are just too difficult to use at lower levels, resulting in an unwillingness to grind out the skill. This question scored an average of 6.1 in our survey. We did also ask one final question in this section about how players felt in regards to the variety of firearms currently available in Build 42. Again, the largest proportion of answers fell into the neutral zone, with 21.4% of responses scoring a 5 out of 10. While the results for this question were a fairly mixed bag, as you can see from our bar chart, there was a bit more of a positive response than there was a negative one, although a few comments did ask for a few more additions to the pool of firearms currently available in-game. Alright, so we've actually only got a couple of sections left to cover, and the next one is focused on all things animal husbandry, hunting, and fishing. Our first question in this section was one we expected a pretty clear answer on, and to be honest, that's exactly what we got. We asked how players felt about the new animals in Build 42, with a very solid 44.2% majority scoring it a 10 out of 10, and almost all of the responses from the survey being 5 and above. Universally, players liked animals, and that's no huge surprise. Our next question, however, digging into the animal husbandry mechanics specifically, allowed for more detailed feedback and certainly had a more interesting spread of scores. While most of the scores were still within that upper 5 range, and the most popular response was 10 out of 10 with 22.6%, it was clear that some players felt there was still room for improvement despite the mostly positive mood towards husbandry. And really, that makes sense considering how young of age these features are. A hefty number of responses also selected 5 out of 10 here, and it was clear from the feedback that a lot of players hadn't engaged with animal husbandry yet simply because they weren't really sure how to properly care for their animals. To me, this indicates that animal husbandry might require a bit more of a tutorial or some more intuitive design to ensure that players know how to get the most out of these features. That said, Project Zomboid has always been a game that doesn't hold your hand, and I'm sure once Build 42 reaches the stable branch, there will be a ton of YouTube guides out there for the subject. Honestly, this is sort of a tough one. You don't want to stray too far from the original spirit of the game and the challenge that brings, but at the same time, you don't want it to push players away because it's too hard to get into. I wouldn't want to be in the developer's shoes with this one because it is a very tricky issue. The average score for animals was 8.5, and there was an average score of 7.3 for the associated husbandry mechanics. Next, we asked two questions, one on how players felt about hunting and tracking, and the other being on how they felt about fishing. I'm grouping these together because much of the feedback we received pertained to both questions. I'll display the bar charts from each question on screen now, and immediately you can see a common theme here. Lots of neutral answers. I was expecting this for all things hunting and tracking, but not so much for fishing. Judging by your comments, there's a lot of you out there that haven't tried these features at all since Build 42 dropped. Now, I'm speculating here using my own knowledge of the game, but I'd like to hazard an educated guess that this is based on the returns from such an activity at low skill levels. Both fishing and hunting skills in their current forms are incredibly difficult in the low levels, and when you do finally get something, the chances are the fish you've caught is very, very small indeed, or the meat you're getting from the deer you've hunted down isn't of high quality and thus isn't worth the effort. Not to mention that hunting's issues are compounded by how difficult firearms currently are to train in Build 42. There were a lot of amazing suggestions for you guys on how to add to the fishing and hunting mechanics brought to to Build 42, like this comment that mentions some finer interactions to try and tempt fish to take the bait, or the multiple comments we had suggesting the use of quieter weapons like bows, throwing spears, or crossbows to help with hunting if you weren't trained in firearms or don't want to draw too much attention from nearby zombies. Referring back to the bar charts once more here, you can see a general positivity towards these features, but there's definitely the feeling they require further updates to reach their full potential, and again, that is completely fair with them being on the unstable branch and ultimately not finished. Okay, so that brings me to the last couple of questions in our survey, and this next one refers to quite a specific and recent change added in the 42.10 update, which landed on the 30th of June. This update contained changes to zombie spawning and distribution with implementation of something called Voronoi noise. This was meant to randomize which areas see zombie spawns, so things are a little different every time you play. In one playthrough, the Gigamart at West Point might be swarmed with Zeds, and on an entirely different save, they may wander elsewhere, for example. We did make this an optional question for players that hadn't played since this specific update, so we only had 424 responses total to this question, as opposed to the 593 responses we saw for the other parts of the survey. Results were pretty scattered for this one, but mostly over the upper half of the scoreboard. The most popular score was 7 out of 10, with 10 and 8 following close behind. I won't spend any longer on this one because the next question we had definitely shows just how strongly people feel about multiplayer, one way or another. For this one, we asked how much of an impact has the lack of multiplayer in Build 42 had on your experience, with 0 being a major impact and 10 being no impact at all. This was the bar chart for the results. Notice how just shy of 50% of the answers are either a 0 or a 10. Now, Project Zomboid has always had two communities, those that play multiplayer or co-op with their friends, and those that simply don't. There is a huge single-player community for Project Zomboid, and I think it's easy for those in the other camp to forget they even exist. Needless to say, we had some very strong feedback from those that miss multiplayer. I think this shows that there is a large single-player only presence in the Zomboid fanbase. A lot of people are really itching to get back into multiplayer though, and that side of the community has definitely grown since Build 41. So, is it time for the developers to reconsider their staggered approach to development with this in mind? I can't say for sure. I know they have reasons when it comes to why this is the way their development works, but it's certainly a blocker that is keeping many players away for the time being. Okay, so we've almost reached the end of this video, and there is one final question we asked all of our little guinea pigs to answer before they finish the survey. How do you feel overall about Build 42? This was going to be a really telling response, and ultimately the decider on whether the community does actually enjoy the major update, or whether it's just been a bit mediocre. Well, without any further ado, here's the bar chart for this question, with 8 out of 10 being the most popular answer with a weighting of 36.4% and most of the other responses being in the upper range. It is immediately clear that the majority of players do in fact feel that Build 42 is a net upgrade for Project Zomboid, and I'm sure there are some of you out there that strongly disagree, but overall it is a well-received update. The average score for Build 42 as a whole was 7.9. There is, as with many of the individual features in this survey, room for improvement as this build gets closer and closer to the stable branch. That opinion is echoed by these results, and I'll say that I'm mostly on the same level here. Some elements of Build 42 have been a major success, like the new areas added to the game world, but others, like crafting and various skills, may require a bit more time in the oven before they are ready for the stable branch. What makes that particularly difficult is that while all of this is still being figured out, we're unlikely to see multiplayer, and the longer it takes the development team to work out the kinks, the more frustrated that large part of the community will become, and honestly, I can't necessarily blame them. So, before we wrap things up, I just want to circle back to what actually prompted me to make this video. Well, I want to clarify, this wasn't an attempt to focus on the negatives of Build 42 or trash the developers' efforts in any way. Rather, the opposite, in fact. Regular viewers of my channel will know that I am often a big supporter of the development team, and that hasn't changed with this update. That said, I do feel it's important to offer feedback in a constructive manner, even when it might not be entirely positive. Otherwise, how can the developers be expected to know if changes they are making are actually pleasing the majority of their player base? So, being a content creator with a primarily Zomboid-centric audience, I'm in a unique position where I get to see much of the sentiment that the community has in my comments section, and then I can use those opinions to exploit you all for videos. But no, in all seriousness, I want to say thank you to everyone that took part in this survey. I feel like this is a really pivotal moment in Project Zomboid's lifetime, and you are ultimately the ones that will help to shape what comes next. For that reason, all of the responses in this survey and our data have been shared with the Indie Stone directly, and I hope that your feedback goes some way to molding the next stage of the game that you know and love. I also want to say a very special thank you once again to We Are Wild for acknowledging that my audience is the perfect target for a deodorant brand and sponsoring this video. You can follow my link down in the description. That's it from me in this one, folks, but hopefully you've enjoyed this deep dive into the community's outlook on Build 42 so far, and I will see you all in the next one.